I hope you guys had a good time getting to meet some of your fellow advocates, some of the other people in the Zoom today. And so I will turn it over to Sarah, because Sarah really is the brains behind this. I'm just the MC, but she's the actual expert in this situation. But yeah, so we're going to be hearing from Sarah Owsley, our policy manager. We're going to be hearing from Lee Camp from ArchCity Defenders in St. Louis. And we're going to be hearing from Kennedy Moehrs Gardner, who is with the Metro St. Louis Equal Housing Opportunity Council. So I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Nashelle. I appreciate that. We're going to talk about eviction today, and I just feel like I want to say right off the bat that there are so many people probably on this call who know this issue better than I do, having experienced evictions in the past or working with households as they kind of weather that storm. It's a really devastating and life-changing situation for households to go through. And so I just want to start with some education about like kind of the gravity of what happens as a household faces eviction. Nashelle's going to put some slides up for me here in just a minute so that you still get to look at all of my weird hand gestures while I speak to you and be able to also get some of the information here. Although that face did not look very encouraging, like Nashelle felt confident about her ability to do that. So I'm a policy and advocacy director for Empower Missouri. We're, of course, a 120-year-old organization here in our state who's working to eradicate poverty. We know poverty can be ended here for our neighbors, and it's an untenable situation that we need to be working towards actively changing. We often want to make sure folks understand 13% of our neighbors live below the federal poverty line, including 18% of the children who live in our state. For those of you in St. Louis, that's 17 Busch Stadiums. For us here in Kansas City, that's Arrowhead 10 times. That's a really staggering number and should be really unacceptable to most of us. We have identified oh, Nashelle, should I just go ahead and share the slides here, friend?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
My computer rebooted and now it won't let me share things.
Not a problem. You just don't get to look at my weird faces anymore. So,
sorry
all
about
excited
that.
to know. Oh yeah, that's not a problem. Here we go. So we've identified these drivers of poverty and the impacts that poverty really touches in folks' lives. Today, we're really going to focus on the affordable housing aspect, but we want to be sure that every time we talk about both situations and impacts of poverty, we really understand that it's a whole system. It really impacts an individual or family's entire way that they operate and the options that are ahead of them. It has far-reaching impacts, and we need to be really clear about that. So we definitely want to frame eviction as an issue that most often happens to families in poverty. While there are reasons that other households may experience eviction or displacement, for the most part, those are usually because households are unable to afford their rent. And it's important to understand why households are unable to afford their rent. I think it's very easy for us who may not understand the state of affordable housing across Missouri to say, like, you should have just chosen a place with cheaper rent or something you could actually afford. And it's really important for us to understand that those units don't exist across our state. There on the left, you'll see that for every 100 households that are looking for a home that is affordable, that is 30% of their income, affordable to them, there's only 43 units that even exist. So more than half of the households in our state who have extremely low incomes just can't ever find housing that is affordable to them. They just won't find it. That's also true at 50% AMI. That's what we usually call low income. In Kansas City and St. Louis, that's like $40,000 a year. That's a pretty significant wage for folks to still not be able to afford housing because there's just not enough rental units that are available at that price point. We often talk about the need for middle income or even workforce housing. those are coded words usually for households who are making about 100% of the AMI or 80% of the AMI. And just as a refresher, the AMI is the area median income. So it's just like the average wage of the workers in a particular area. And the data show us that there's plenty of units available in those price ranges. So what we really want to look at, though, is the number of folks who are cost burdened. That the research is really clear, and I think many of us in our own lives can understand if you make 100% or 80% of AMI, if you're making a pretty good wage, most of us don't spend 30% of our income on housing. That really is a number that is outdated, and we call that fiscally smart. And what that means is even though there might be 79 units available at the price point that's affordable for people at 50% AMI, that doesn't mean they have access to those units or that all 79 of those 100 units are full of people who make 50% AMI, because often they're full of people who make a higher income, who are more attractive renters without previous evictions, without other tenant disruptions or rental disruptions. So we really want to talk about the affordable housing crisis in the terms of who is paying too much for their housing. Nobody really makes a conscious choice to spend 50% of their income on housing. No one is like, man, I just really don't want any extra resources to pay for medicine or recreation or food, right? So households that are cost burdened, we can generally assume that those households had extreme difficulty finding housing that was affordable to them and are trying to sort of piecemeal things together to be able to pay for their living expenses, which are a huge and important need that all of us can recognize. So on the right there, you'll see that for all of our neighbors who are extremely low income, so they're making about 30% of what the average is or lower, almost all of those households are paying too much. They're paying more than 30%. 85% of those households are cost burdened. 65%, more than half, are paying 50% or more. So more, so half of what they bring home every month goes towards just their living expenses, just their rent and utilities. That's really untenable. Those are the types of situations that really set folks up for an eviction, because you just can't do that for a long period of time. It works fine until you run over a nail and you need a new tire, or a family member out of town gets sick and suddenly you need to travel. There's all sorts of emergency situations that happen in households that really require more flexibility in the family budget than 50% of our housing off the top, or 50% of our income off the top goes towards housing. And again, we see that, right, for the households who have higher income, those households don't spend significant amounts of their income towards housing. Many of us do not look at our monthly budget and think like, oh, I really could be spending more on housing, so I should move. Instead, we call that fiscally smart and feel good. So 27% of rental households in the state of Missouri are considered extremely low income. For around the state, that's about $25,000, $25,750 a year. There are just a shortage of 122,000 units. So just off the bat, 122,075 households in our state cannot access housing that's affordable to them because it does not exist. These are households who are already rental households. These are not like homeowner households that are entering the rental market. And these numbers are all pre-COVID. We still do not have numbers of how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted rental housing, though I think anybody who works in the affordable housing sphere, and certainly anybody who ever talks to their friends about housing costs or read any news articles at all, understands that as home prices have exploded over the last 2 years, rental costs have also exploded. And we anticipate that this number is going to be significantly higher when we really start to look at the impact of
Sarah,
the pandemic. Yes.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick. Okay, there it is. I was going to say your screen's blank, but thank you.
Yeah, I think that the Chromebook situation is not always the fastest for us, so sorry about that.
Oh, you're good. Just making sure.
Yeah. The other thing that I want to point out is that chart down there at the bottom. Who are these extremely low income renter households? Because there's a sort of false belief, I think, that these are households who are just like lazy or choosing not to be in the workforce. And instead, 34% are folks who work and don't make wages that can, make housing affordable to them in our state. This isn't a national number. This is us in Missouri, a state that often considers ourselves to be a really affordable place to live. Most of those households who are unable to find housing are working. They might also have young kids or family members who need a caregiver, or they might be disabled themselves. So most of the folks who are able to work are working and still not able to secure housing that's affordable to them. The next thing I want to touch on for eviction is that eviction is a racial equity issue. Black and other households of color are twice as likely to be renters. They are disproportionately rent burdened. These households often pay higher rates of rent than other households in the same community. The Kansas City Eviction Project has done 18 years worth of research here in the Kansas City area and has demonstrated through that data that when all other demographics, including income, are held steady, Black households are still more likely to face eviction. So it's not always just a wage issue. That's what this data shows us, is it's not always just a wage issue. There is racial equity implications. Hopefully the screen has flipped over to this next slide where you'll be able to see these maps that I have put in. They are also from the Kansas City Eviction Project, and these are from Kansas City, though St. Louis also has very similar maps that go north and south along the Del Mar Divide. This is east and west on the Truce Divide here in Kansas City. You'll see that where there are areas with higher Black population, they have also much higher eviction rates. For folks who are not used to Kansas City or are not used to St. Louis, that's often a really surprising map for people to look at for the first time. And for those of us who are in those communities, often we're not surprised at all. That's exactly what we anticipate. Helps to really show us that eviction is a poverty issue, it is a wage issue, and it has significant ties to racial equity. It's important for folks to understand that eviction has these insurmountable, sometimes collateral consequences. It's not the same thing as when a household chooses to move. These forced moves happen very quickly. Often, particularly when it's a result of an eviction, these households don't have resources to be able to secure a place to go. So eviction is often a way that households experience homelessness for the first time. Heads of households almost always experience lost wages, at least several days worth. Sometimes they lose their job altogether. With a brand new eviction on your record, it's incredibly difficult to secure housing, especially in that environment that I showed you earlier where there are not enough affordable units. So those households and families moved into less safe housing, less desirable housing, often different neighborhoods and communities than where they were before. The entire family often can experience mental health consequences like anxiety and depression as a result. And it's important for us to really remember that often eviction is accompanied by a loss of many of the resources that you have in your home right now. Your personal items, historical documents, things that are important to you, memory, baby photos, next month's stockpile of food, etc. There's a loss of sometimes everything in your home, and often almost everything, because you choose the items that are the most important, and it's oftentimes like just what you can fit in your car that day or for a day or two, because you don't have time to move properly. This is particularly impactful for the youngest of our neighbors. Kids miss school days. They often change schools. Superintendent Bladell has frequently said that the biggest issue his school district faces is school mobility, and it's almost always a result of a forced move. So these households that either through a formal eviction or an informal eviction move quickly, those kids change schools and it's really difficult to keep up with them. They lose connections with their community and their peers, their friends, mentors around them, and they experience at least a period, but often a very long period of decreased nutrition access. If you are moving from the home you lived in and you lose everything and you stay for a couple of weeks with a family member and then you're in a new neighborhood, you can understand how the overall stability of these kids is really disrupted. And it makes a significant trauma mark on these developing brains. So I don't want to just leave us with all the things that feel hard and sad and terrible. There are things that the state of Missouri could implement to help reform this process, help support families throughout this process, and make this a little bit easier transition for folks, or at the very least, more difficult for people in power to kind of implement onto families. So I'm going to be joined by a couple of friends of mine, and we're going to really just sort of have an informal discussion around eviction, around its impacts, eviction as both a cause and condition of poverty, and the things that we can look at and look towards to really reduce how that functions in families' lives. So we've got Lee Camp, an attorney with ArchCity Defenders with us, and Kennedy Moehrs Gardner, an attorney with EHOC in St. Louis. And I'm going to represent the Kansas City voice today, and we're just going to kind of chat through some stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and end my share so that you can see me again as a person, and hopefully that will be slightly more inviting. Here we go. Lee, Kennedy. I'm going to go ahead and just invite Lee to sort of share some reflections and thoughts first.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Again, my name is Lee Camp. I'm an attorney with ArchCity Defenders, and for the past about 7.5 years of my life, I've been representing tenants facing evictions and pushing for housing justice, really in the St. Louis area, and have expanded that work throughout Missouri. I think when we, that there's so much information and we know the damage. It's not hypothetical or conjecture at this point. It's based in data at this point, and we can really tie it to all these, different symptoms of poverty and really call evictions what they are, another driver of poverty at this point. And so when we look at the eviction crisis, I really think we have to go up a level. And I'm actually optimistic coming out of the pandemic that we're starting to do this. We have to truly commit to talking about housing, including rental housing, as a human right in this state, in this country, and really throughout the world. And again, I point out that I'm optimistic coming out of the pandemic on that, which may seem surprising, in a time where we saw illegal evictions happening all over the place, and we still saw 13,000 eviction filings since the start of the pandemic in Missouri. But we're finally starting conversations about policies that can be enacted to really lessen the burdens that evictions have. We're looking at ways the courts can be reformed to have evictions take longer than 10 minutes. If you've never sat in an eviction docket or been in an eviction court, it's nothing but assembly line justice. There's no semblance of actual, the scales being balanced for the parties there. It is a rubber stamp for a landlord to remove someone from their home, again, in about 10 minutes, in most cases, in my experience. And so I have this moment of optimism where, I've been meeting with everyone from our federal delegation down to local elected officials and those that have taken to the streets to raise their voice and say, it's time we have a change in the way that we talk about housing in our state, and it's time that we talk about evictions in a different way and really, acknowledge these dire consequences that they're having on our communities. And so I can get into the weeds a little bit deeper, but I at least wanted to make those comments, and then I'll kick it to Kennedy.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone. My name is Kennedy Meehrs Gardner, and I'm a staff attorney with the Metropolitan St. Louis Equal Housing and Opportunity Council. I'm relatively new to this work. Lee's been doing it a lot longer than I have, but I think with my newness comes a relatively new perspective too, which makes me a little bit optimistic, more so than my friends that have been in it for a while, I think. But like Lee was saying, I think it's awful that it's taken something so horrible to start this conversation on a broader level with the pandemic. And I mean, there has been some good things that have come out of the pandemic. We've learned how this rental assistance can work, and that's helped a lot of people. But like Lee was saying, the bigger issue here is talking about housing as a human right, and getting affordable housing available for the folks in our communities, because it's just disappearing rapidly in St. Louis and in Kansas City and across the country right now, especially with the housing boom that's going on. So yeah, day to day, I work with clients facing eviction. I see a lot of really horrible situations that they're going through, and the courts have not slowed down at all. In fact, I would say they've sped up on these evictions, and we don't foresee any moratoriums being put in place in the future again either. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, I think the conversation we need to be having is that bigger conversation about housing as a human right, because nothing's going to change until we start diving into that a little deeper.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I really appreciate that. I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of pick up on from Lee was your comment around making evictions harder to file, making them more difficult for property owners. And I just wanted to have a conversation about that. I wrote our weekly perspective today around the eviction process in the state of Missouri, and that most evictions that move forward are for less than 1 month's rent, $600, less than $600 often. And that one of the proposed reforms to really eliminate or reduce the number of evictions that are filed for such, relatively small past-owed rents is making it more expensive. The filing fee for a property owner is almost nothing for most of the state of Missouri. And when you make that fee that they have to pay out of pocket up front more specific, more larger, then it becomes more difficult then for those communities to move forward. And so I just was wondering if the two of you can kind of speak to your experience and thoughts around that.
Sure, I'm happy to chime in first. Certainly evictions are easy to file. If you're a mom and pop landlord, not a corporation, you generally don't need to hire an attorney to file an eviction. You need to pay about $150, and that's what it takes to get an eviction filed. And it's pretty simple, primarily because the tenants are never represented in this equation, and landlords have learned to work the courts in a very, kind of simple way. And the courts are so backed up that they have to push these cases through. So they're not paying a lot of attention to what's going on. And I would agree, anything that makes it more difficult to file would be helpful. I can't give you a perspective in the St. Louis region, at least. If a landlord is a corporation, they do have to hire an attorney. It's about $250 to $300 to file an eviction with an attorney. Some people pay that to fix a traffic ticket. So, these are not taken seriously. The costs themselves say that. And we do see that you can file an eviction. You can file an eviction for $1 in late rent being owed. And it would take a Kennedy or I going into court. And if the person could come up with $1, we'd probably have to fight to get the eviction thrown out before the landlord would even accept the dollar. We just don't have a difficult process here, and we're not an anomaly by any means. It is easy to evict throughout the United States. I would actually argue Missouri maybe sits in the middle of its process in evicting people on our timelines that we go through. But when we see 13,000 eviction filings happening during a pandemic, during a time when there was a federal eviction moratorium, multiple local moratoriums, we never had one in this state, that should be scary to us, that number was able to balloon, even with protections out there, with rental assistance out there. And that just speaks to the ease and going through this process for a landlord and their knowledge that tenants frequently, are just bullied through the system.
Yeah, I think to echo with that, it's a money game for these landlords. That's really the end game. And so making it more expensive for them to file these evictions could create a barrier for some landlords. I mean, I can't promise that it would do that in the end, because a lot of these landlords just seem to want their tenants out no matter what, no matter what we say to them or what we do. But yeah, it's really easy to file an eviction, and these tenants don't know their rights a lot of the time. And if they don't know of an organization like Lee's or ours, then they're out of luck and they're going to fight this in court, or they don't even show up for court because they don't know how the process works, or they're scared of court, like a lot of people would be, like I am too. It's difficult for people to navigate, and it's a scary process. So yeah, it's if we could up the price it costs to file these evictions, or somehow put other barriers into place, I think that would be helpful for tenants for sure.
And if I can make one point on when I'm using landlord, at least, I'm sure this is the same for Kennedy. When I'm talking about landlords here, I always get the question, what about the mom and pop landlords, right? They're the ones that have to eat the $50 the hardest. This eviction crisis is not driven by single family homeowners. It is driven by corporate landlords and speculators, real estate speculators. I'm looking at my notes here. Since October of 2017, in the St. Louis area, 10 properties have accounted for a third of the eviction filings in our area. One landlord comprises 10 of those different properties. And so this is at a time when landlords are seeing corporate landlords seeing record profit margins and throwing money around to acquire housing as quickly as possible. It is certainly a money game, but who's driving this? Corporate landlords. It is not the small mom and pop landlord at all. Just want to throw that clarification out.
Yeah, I miss meeting in person and doing big community meetings, because I would often, from a stage or whatever, talk about eviction as a business model. And then I would have local landlords come up to me and be like, eviction can't be a business model. It's expensive. It takes time. I always wait until my tenants are a couple of months behind on their rent to file an eviction. And I said, you are not the one we're trying to reform, right? Like, what if everybody was playing that same kind of game? Because there are absolutely these big corporate landlords that will file an eviction when you're a day late and $20 short. And most of the landlords who actually live in their community and interact with their neighbors don't experience eviction court the same way. So I think that that's a really important distinction there to make, Lee. I saw in the chat a question about rural parts of the state, and Lee sort of mentioned it as well. A big portion of our state never had any type of a local moratorium. They were only covered by the CDC moratorium. And many of the municipal courts across the state really didn't even want to listen to the CDC moratorium, and evictions moved forward in those communities even throughout the pandemic. We had counties in our state who experienced a 300% increase of evictions during that year of 2021. That's significant. That's way more households displaced. And in rural parts of the state, often these households go directly into what we would call like street homelessness, literal homelessness, because there are not resources to help them get reconnected to households. And so then those sort of collateral consequences of eviction are even larger. And so that's a really good question, and I'm really thankful to have had it. Kennedy, do you have any sort of thoughts around what this looks like across the rural part of the state? I don't think you've done much work there, but.
We've done a little bit out in like Jefferson County, out in the more rural areas of Missouri. But what we've seen is that evictions are moving faster than in the city and county of St. Louis, just because it's easier for the sheriff to get out there. The sheriff doesn't have as many usually to execute. So, I mean, it's moving weeks at a time, like they can get in and get out and get the person out of their home. So yeah, that's very alarming that they're happening so quickly across the rest of the state, even while they're happening quickly in St. Louis city and county too.
Yeah, absolutely, Kennedy. Thanks for bringing up sort of like how quickly evictions often move. I think households who have not experienced eviction or who only really interact with kind of the other side of the experience sort of understand that often tenants aren't really notified like they're supposed to be. If you don't show up to court, it might be because you didn't know about court. Like yes, court is a scary place to be. It's taking a day off of work. You have to like wear proper shoes, right? I don't want to go to court either. That's why I'm not an attorney. So it's a scary place to be. But also, we often have stories, I'm sure Kennedy and Lee both have stories where the tenants really didn't even know they were, subject to an eviction. And so they know about it the day that the eviction is done, right? And then they have 10 days, those households, and maybe they get notified that first day, and often they don't even. So households really do experience that turnaround very quickly. And because they're unrepresented often, those tenants really don't have a way to say, actually, here are emails from my landlord where I said I was $50 short this month and he said it was fine. And now here I am 3 weeks later, being formally evicted from this property after a small emergency in my household. So Lee, can you share a little bit about like how quickly those evictions often happen for households?
Yeah, in the St. Louis area, if you go through the court process, we're a longer area, right, compared to the rural areas, as Kennedy just pointed to. From the day an eviction lawsuit is filed till a judgment, and I say that because 90% of these cases end in judgments against tenants. From the day it's filed till the tenant is set out, it's probably about 45 days. And that would be, man, that might be a little generous even at times. And so it rockets through the court. I call the dockets rocket dockets. I mean, they process 100 cases a day in multiple divisions in the city of St. Louis, 2 different divisions, and about 7 divisions in St. Louis County that could have 50 eviction cases on each of those dockets. Sure, an occasional technicality, one will be thrown out every once in a while, but we have like 18 families that are evicted every day in the St. Louis region. It's not 18 people, that's 18 families. That's kids uprooted from their schools, families removed from their neighborhoods with the park across the street or the community garden that they participate in. This rattles communities, and it does so at a breakneck speed. I mean, it really is troubling that we take someone's home away in such a quick manner. We do so without the assistance of counsel. We do so with judges that are so busy. I'm not saying this to disparage the bench at all. They're too busy because there are so many filings coming in. It is really a difficult thing that we're dealing with right now. And to Kennedy's point, it's only speeded up since the pandemic backlog is now having to be processed through the courts.
Yeah, absolutely. Christine Daw raised their hand, wants to ask a question. Do you want to come off mute, Christine?
Hi, I wasn't so much a question, but it was a comment on you talking about it. It's a business model. And that's not just in our state. I lived in Utah for a while. And if you're $20 late on your rent, they are filing. They are filing within 5 days of the first of the month. And you're in court by the 10th of the month. And they have an automatic 3 times your monthly rent fee that they charge on top of it. So if someone's $50 late on their rent, $50 short on their rent, it's going to cost them, and their rent's $1,500 a month, it's going to cost them over $4,000 to pay for that, for that $20. That's a business model.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
they're out before the end of the month.
Yeah, fees was another thing that came up in the chat box and through our talking that I definitely wanted to sort of note on. Those fees have a really significant impact on affordable housing, not just for tenants who fall behind. And something that we saw through the pandemic is as rental assistance took time to get to tenants, landlords were continuing to charge fees every day. And so lots of tenants talked to me and explained that they had paid like 2 months worth of rent and late fees that was not covered by the rental assistance on top of the 3 months worth of rental assistance that they got. And so it really didn't provide the break for all households that we really needed and were looking for. There's no regulation in our state and no way to regulate the late fees that landlords charge because we have a prohibition on rent control, and that will look like rent control. And so it's impossible really right now, the way the statutes are written, to even begin to sort of regulate some of those late fees or application fees. We have seen during the pandemic, but even before, rental application fees have skyrocketed. And early in my time at Empower Missouri, I heard about a landlord in the Springfield area who was charging $250 just for the application fee. This not refunded if you don't, if you aren't able to move into that home. So $250 for every application. Now I hear about that all the time across the state because landlords and these big corporations understand that the housing crisis has left even more people really desperate to secure housing. Lee or Kennedy, can either of you sort of speak to the kind of devastating consequences of these compounding fees that tenants are often facing?
Yeah, I can go first on that one. So yeah, I mean, we see this every day. We see the consequences of these fees and the consequences of an eviction filing too. I think those go hand in hand. So even if somehow a tenant's able to get into contact with us and we're able to represent them in court and have their eviction case dismissed, that has dire consequences for the rest of their lives, really. To even have an eviction filing can prevent them from finding any stable housing in the future. Oftentimes they'll lose their jobs because they had to go to court, or they're not stably housed. So it leads to mental illness issues, like all of the above. And we've had a really hard time too. So I work in conjunction with some really awesome housing resource specialists, which I think do more of a job than what I even do in the court system. They're providing our clients with a lot of housing resources, but they have an issue getting clients rehoused with an eviction on their record. We've had so many issues finding any type of affordable housing for our clients to move into after they have had an eviction. So it's a really dire circumstance if you have an eviction filed against you, even if you do go ahead and get it dismissed somehow. And along with that, these fees that come along with it. So even if you get an eviction dismissed, sometimes you have to pay the fees if it's not dismissed in the correct way. And so it's just, yeah, it's a snowball effect. And so how are they going to get back on their feet and find a new place to live if they owe $250 in a security deposit plus 2 months rent to get a deposit on a place, plus these fees that they still have to pay from their court case, and they've lost their job because of all the instability going on in their lives. So yeah, it's just a recipe for disaster, and it's really tough to get out of. Yeah.
There are states who have looked at eviction expungement. In the state of Missouri, really never does it roll off. And so landlords can run background checks and find 15-year-old evictions that have nothing to do with what kind of tenant that person might be now, and prevent them from being able to secure housing at that point. That's absolutely right. It really hangs on for a very long time. And it's so black and white, right? If you find an old eviction on a tenant's record, like, you just assume a lot about what was going on in that household during that time. And it really is not often the case, right? Like, as we've shared, it's usually not the tenant who moves in with their 6 pit bulls that weren't on the application and destroyed everything and didn't pay rent for 8 months. Often that's not the case of evicted tenants in the state of Missouri. And so I think that's a really good point to bring up there. Kennedy, did you take yourself off mute?
Yeah, I was going to jump in there because to both your points, I think it was best summed up by Matthew Desmond in his Pulitzer-winning book, Evicted. He calls it a scarlet E. It literally is a mark on the tenant that makes it harder for them to find housing because of that credit reporting issue. The tenants still have to pay the $25 fee, and then it shows up on a landlord screening report or tenant screening report. These are just credit checks that could easily be, kind of modified in the way that they could be used under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There's federal ways that we could intervene in the use of those, but they're not right now. And so landlords collect the fee, move them on to the next house. And what we commonly see happen is the tenant ends up in worse housing stock. Worse housing is more expensive housing. Your utility bills go up. You're forced to pay for, pest control, those type things. And then it becomes untenable to live in, dilapidated housing stock. And so then you're back in the cycle. Here we go again. That's why this is a cycle. An eviction is not a period on the end of a sentence. It's actually the start of a new sentence.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I appreciate both your comments. And in the chat, Martha talked about like rundown homes that are really not livable kind of environments. That has long lasting health outcomes on the kids who are there. And Lee's comment around like cheap housing is often more expensive. There's tons of data that show that often rental properties are some of the most expensive to live in because you've got higher fees when something breaks, you're paying higher utility fees, all sorts of issues that often are not fixed by the landlord, right? Like it's a moral thing, right? That we understand if you're renting a home, you should not also be doing like the upkeep. But all the time, those of us who are in regular contact with tenants, we hear about landlords who refuse to address things that are broken in the home, leaking pipes, et cetera, that cause damage to then the tenants, things that they own that are in that home. There really regularly are stories of like ceilings falling in on these low income tenants, and the landlord had just refused to address a leaking pipe for 2 years until it like caused actual physical damage to someone's health, oftentimes those kids. So that's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think, Lee, your comment around like there are ways, right? There are very few other things that would be on your credit history that are accessible in the way that an eviction is. And if something's not right and it's been paid for in other ways, right? If you've got a past due medical bill that you paid up and it was 3 years ago, you could write a letter and they'll take it off your credit. There's no process right now for tenants to have an eviction removed from their record. And it's entirely, I believe, a systemic issue where we just really want to continue to harm poor people, right, across our state and keep them from safe and flourishing living situations. So we just have like 5-ish more minutes before we're going to let folks go. I wanted to thank both of you, Lee and Kennedy, so much for joining me today and chatting through this like so important issue and the impact that it has across our state. Kennedy, have you got any closing remarks for us before we go? And then I'll let Lee.
I would just say that everyone stay passionate about this issue. I think what's really important is getting the community involved and having this be a tenant-led movement too. And so what I've seen in St. Louis, I would love to see something like what happened in Kansas City with KC tenants because it was wonderful. But yeah, just keep an eye on this, and the situation isn't going away. And like Lee said, we really need to dive deep into this conversation about housing as a human right. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, particularly out of the pandemic where I started. I did not plan on talking about the pandemic so much, but don't waste this crisis, right? We've seen some things that have worked. We've started to look for upstream solutions, and we've seen these enacted in places like Texas, right? Where people are getting attorneys or they're going through mediations. We're using things. And in Missouri, our legislature is going the opposite way as it so frequently does. We need to seize this opportunity. There's more data and more empirical evidence, more scholarship even than I've ever seen in this area. We need to heed that knowledge and really start to put policies into place to change this, because at the end of the day, it is a poverty issue and this is a racial justice issue, as we started with.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much. I just really appreciate your time and passion and the work that you're doing for tenants there in the St. Louis area. I did want to clarify, we have a good working relationship with KC tenants. This day happened to fall on the same day they do a big staff retreat. So there wasn't any staff available and they weren't able to secure a leader for us. And so they are not unrepresented. They're just in our hearts, I guess. I have worked closely with them for a long time and I'm just always really so pleased when impacted people really take charge and stand up against these social structures that we know are completely unfair and harmful. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nichelle, who has some closing remarks for us, including the link to the evaluation and how you can get CEUs.
Yeah, thank you. This was a really good discussion to sit in on. And like Sarah said, I'm just going to close this out with a couple of announcements. So first of all, please take our survey. We want to make sure that every time we do these Friday forums, they get better and better. So here we have a link to the survey. It's very quick. It takes less than 5 minutes to do. So that's the first announcement I want to give. Second is, if you are a Missouri social worker, this forum it does qualify for continuing education hours. So I put instructions in the chat, but please email Christine at empowermissouri.org. Her email is in the chat box. You do need to fill out the evaluation in order to receive those hours. Well, like I said, it's just 5 minutes, and email Christine. You're gonna need your information to send to her. I will have all of the details about that exact information in the follow-up email to this event. So you'll be getting that email from me. And then the next thing I want to point out is that we did change up a bit our Friday forum schedule to respond to some of the things going on in the Capitol right now. So another thing I'm putting in the chat is a link to our Friday forum schedule. You can see some of the updated events we have in the next couple months. We like to make sure that whatever we do is responding to what's happening right now in the Capitol and how it's affecting people throughout the state. So if you haven't looked at our Friday forum schedule since last year, you're going to notice a few new things going on. But yeah, so those are the main ones I have. Do you think I forgot anything, Sarah? I
have no idea. I doubt it very much, Nichelle. You're so capable and on top of everything. I feel great about it. Thank you.
But yeah, so thank you guys so much for coming. Enjoy your weekend. Like I said, you will get an email from me. Someone asked up earlier, they asked if anyone has any resources they're willing to share. If you have resources you want to share with the group, send me an email at Nichelle at, that's not an at, empowermissouri.org. And I will include that in the follow-up email I'm going to send all of you on Monday. So yeah, if you've got anything you want to share, please let me know.
Sorry, I did just want to quickly plug the Affordable Housing Coalition that we're meeting twice a month right now, exactly about bills related to affordable housing, eviction reform, tenant protections, all sorts of topics that are well in line with today's Friday Forum event. We've got a lot of really powerful voices in that room, and we need you there as well. If you're interested in this topic, please join us. It is open participation, and new folks will not stick out. We'd love to have you, so please plan to join us. We actually have a call coming up on Monday at 2 o'clock.
And you can find the full schedule at empowermissouri.org. Go to the events tab and you'll find all that.